I wanted to discuss drafting a bill to regulate a business or profession. On occasion, bill drafters are asked to create a new regulatory scheme where the legislature desires to regulate a profession or occupation or business that has not previously been subject to regulation. Now, as a general rule, the intent of regulating a profession or an occupation is basically to safeguard the general public and ensure that there are appropriate licensure qualifications and standards for professional conduct by those being licensed. And there are numerous provisions that will have to be drafted in a bill in order to specify things like licensing requirements, any restrictions on activities, the enforcement mechanism, fees to be assessed or collected. And the bill drafter has to first determine whether there's a need to create a separate licensing or certification and what sort of entity will be created in the state, or whether an existing state agency will take care of the licensing and enforcement when you decide to regulate a new occupation or profession. For example, it may be more appropriate to simply add a new regulatory program to an existing state department's duties, powers, responsibilities. On the other hand, a client legislator may desire a new regulatory entity be created. And so that's the course of action then, obviously, for the bill drafter to take. Now, the bill drafter, in creating a new entity to implement a program, will obviously also have to create a statutory framework that includes standards for regulating this profession or occupation. So, what are some of the questions that the bill drafter needs to consider when putting together and drafting a bill to regulate a profession or occupation? This is just a sampling, not exhaustive. What is the activity to be regulated? What is the activity, or how is it going to be defined, that activity? What definitions will be required for the statute? Are any of those definitions found in existing law? Is the activity going to be licensed, certified? Is a new state entity going to need to be created? If so, what is its name, its purpose? What's the scope of practice being regulated in the profession or occupation? Which activities will be allowed? Will there be activities that are specifically prohibited? Should you specify certain activities that can or cannot be performed by this licensed profession or occupation? What sort of requirements will be required for registration, certification, licensure? What form will it take? Are there exemptions from those requirements that ought to be allowed? Are there any minimum educational or training requirements? What about certain qualifications, education, work experience? What are you going to do with the existing folks in that occupation or profession? Will they be grandfathered into this new regulatory scheme? Will you impose any testing requirements for a license? Is it a one-time license or a renewed license? Will there be continuing education requirements? The enforcement mechanisms. Will there be administrative audits, desk audits versus field audits? Are there penalties for violating the law? What happens if a license is suspended or even revoked? What's the basis for licensure, suspension, or revocation? If you're creating a new entity or using an existing entity, how will their activities be funded? Are there one-time fees? Are there ongoing fees? If so, how much? What is the assessment based on? What specific enforcement tools will be provided to an existing entity or a new entity? Will there be administrative remedies only, civil actions allowed, private enforcement? Again, these are just some of the questions for a bill drafter to consider in beginning to outline a new regulatory scheme and then write a statute that creates a new regulating scheme for a new profession or an occupation in the state.